about 1953, 1955, somewhere in that area, the early to mid-1950s. But an objective phenomenon, unrelated to cultural expectations, can be traced well into the 19th century. Now, here's one example I found. I spent a lot of time doing archival research in anomalistics, and I found this incredibly interesting item in the December 6, 1887 issue of an upstate New York newspaper, and it was from a letter written by a correspondent in a nearby village. I'm going to read you exactly what he wrote because I think my paraphrase might dilute its impact, but it's quite striking. Now remember, this is 1887. Nobody's heard of UFOs. Perhaps I might interest some of your readers if I should tell them of a strange phenomenon I saw at sunset, October 24th. I was sitting at a window looking towards the east, watching the clouds as they rolled up from the west, giving us a clear sunset. At the south, the forest sparkled and glistened as if clad in what looked to me like sparkling silver. I began to look around for the cause, and coming from the north was what? I can only describe it like this. About mid-distance between the heavens and earth, and coming at a rapid rate, were what looked like silver balls, reminding me of silver coin of all denominations, bright and sparkling, tumbling and rushing through the air, going towards the east, and finally disappearing beyond the lower stratus of clouds. Two winds were prevailing at the time. The upper stratus of clouds going towards the east, the lower towards the west, and this bushel of sparkling balls below the lower clouds toward the east also. This grand phenomenon was visible for about 4 minutes and was seen by several persons here in town. Can anyone tell me from my description what it was and the cause of it? Now here we have what I call the core UFO phenomenon, structured, metallic in appearance, capable of rapid, even extraordinary movement. It's what Kenneth Arnold saw on June 24, 1947, over the Cascade Mountains, and what an uncountable number of witnesses have reported since. Objects like these have been tracked on radar and other instruments, left puzzling ground traces, stopped motor vehicles, interfered with electrical systems, and provided other kinds of evidence of their physical and technological presence. Reports such as these, a number of them well investigated, impressively documented, lend themselves almost inescapably to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And indeed, if, as exobiologically inclined astronomers argue, our galaxy alone contains hundreds of millions of advanced civilizations, a visible ET presence is more likely than its opposite. But if the ETH is a reasonable fit for hardcore UFO events, the effort to devise a unified field theory of ufology has faltered. And it's faltered because as the UFO controversy has dragged on for more than 6 decades now, UFO phenomena have grown ever more bizarre. I wrote a book about UFOs and ufology in the 1960s and 1970s. The title of it was High Strangeness. And I called it that because during that period, people began to report a range of literally incredible encounters with UFOs, with bizarre UFO-associated entities and creatures, men in black, abductions, otherworldly journeys. While unprovable, though they failed to provide a consistent portrait of an otherworldly order, what connected the stories strongly was the witnesses' evident sincerity and their sincere conviction that they had undergone vivid, profoundly weird experiences with all the resonance of real encounters. In the mid-1960s, the focus of some leading ufologists turned to the high strangeness cases as indicators of what they saw as the true underlying paranormal foundation of all UFO-related occurrences. It was undeniably true that the most exotic manifestations made the ETH pale in comparison, made it look like the product of a failed imagination. And paranormal theorists insisted that UFOs were just a mask covering the face of an unknowable, shape-shifting supernatural intelligence. One critic quipped that such a supernatural intelligence is usually called God. The more highly strange the report, the harder it is to prove that some such event has happened in any ordinarily understood sense of event and happened. Encounters with bizarre entities and otherworldly journeys tended to focus on one individual or a very small group of individuals, and such experiences exist only in memory and testimony. So what are we to make of all this? I think we can get some clues if we go back to the late 19th century and some curious stories that were in circulation then. Beginning in November 1896, people in California began report seeing strange airships flying overhead. And over the next months, the reports drifted eastward into the Midwest and Texas and even out to the East Coast. Many hundreds of reports filled the papers. If you go back to April 1897 and look through old newspapers, you're going to find reports of mystery airships. Now, no such airships were flying in America at the time, according to aviation history, and these reports are preserved in UFO books, not aviation histories. The reports were treated mostly with derision, and the coverage and other social dynamics sort of prefigured the reception of UFO reports decades later. But to those who thought the sightings were not just hoaxes and misidentifications, the belief was that somebody had really invented an airship. And there was hardly a small town in the land that didn't boast some small-town tinker who said he was about to master the mystery and the question of controlled aerial navigation. And in fact, just a few years later at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 2 small-town tinkerers did just that. But the provincial papers of 1897 are not the most reliable source of information. Many tall tales were printed, and one variety of story almost universally rejected as suspect was the 1897 equivalent to the Close Encounter of the Third Kind, where people claimed that they had actually seen the airships land, they had met the crews. The crews were American inventors who gave them a name and said what they were doing and what they were up to and when they were going to declare their invention to the world. And it was generally long assumed that these stories were just pure fiction. But as it happened, after all, if such things couldn't have happened, as aviation historians attest, how could anybody have experienced them? Well, it turns out that apparently people did experience them, as I found out in some research that I've done over the last year or two. I was particularly interested in an incident that was reported in the Houston paper on April 21st, 1897, describing something that is said to have happened late on the evening of April 19th, just outside Beaumont, Texas. J.R. Lagone and his son Charlie were returning home late at night, and they were unhitching the horses when they noticed lights in a nearby pasture. And they walked the several hundred yards to where the lights were, and they discovered there was an immense airship landed in their pasture. And they saw 4 men moving around it. They described the airship as about 180 feet long, 20 feet wide, with 4 large wings. And the aeronauts indicated that they needed water. And so according to Lagone's account in the Houston Post, they came into the house, each of them carrying 2 buckets. The only crew member to provide information, and then only when asked, introduced himself as Wilson. He said that he and his companions had been flying their machine around. They were going back to the Midwest where they had built this and several other comparable airships. Now, on 4 days after the Houston Post published this story, the New Orleans Times-Picayune published an interview with a man identified as Rabbi A. Levy. Levy was a Beaumont resident who was visiting New Orleans at the time. And Levy told the reporter that on a recent night, he had heard that an airship had landed on a farm just outside Beaumont. And he was enormously interested and curious, and he went to the site. And in the darkness, he glimpsed this huge airship landed in the field. And he said, I'm quoting what he told the paper, he said, "I spoke to one of the men, one of the airship crew, when he went into the farmer's house and shook hands with him. Yes, he did say where it was built, but I can't remember the name of the place or the name of the inventor. He said that they had been traveling a great deal. I was so dumbfounded that I could not form an